Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar, Beyond Nudges, What Can the Food Movement Learn from Behavioral Insights? My name is Maddie. I'm here on behalf of Sustain in London today. I'm just going to do a tiny bit of housekeeping before we get into the meaty bits, so to speak, on this webinar, just to make sure everyone can hear me okay. If you can, on the attendee chat on the left-hand side of your screen, could you type in where you're joining from, or where you're listening in from, and what you had for lunch. And we'll just see who's out there, who's with us today, and what kind of things everyone's been eating. I just had a great falafel halloumi wrap, personally. And if anyone is having connection issues, we usually any meeting suggests using Chrome or downloading the desktop app. We've got some people, Thai lunch in Shropshire, Maltesers for lunch at UCL, nice. A sandwich, hummus salad, baked cod. Whoa, cool. Someone had chapati in Amsterdam. Oh, great to have you with us from afar. Sheffield, pasta. Vera had homemade burrito. Fantastic. So it's always very interesting to see what everyone has eaten. So thanks for this. This also gets a really nice sense of how far and wide we reach with our webinars. So on your screen, we've got on this left-hand side of the screen where you're all saying hello, there's two different things. There's the attendee list, so you can see who else is on the webinar with us today. And then there's the chat bar that we're all using right now. So if you have any questions during the webinar, or you want to share information with other people, you want to share something you're working on, or contact details if it's relevant, please feel free to use this chat for any of that. It's public, everyone can see it. But if people do ask questions, I always try to repeat them out loud because we record all of our webinars. And don't be shy to try to connect with other people or share things that might be pertinent to this group. We find this can be a really good opportunity for people to connect across geographic areas. At the top of your screen, there's also something called Ask a Question. There's a little green button that you'll see. If you want to ask the presenters a question privately, you can use that as well, but it's only us that will see it. So we generally encourage people to use the chat bar on the left so other people can benefit from the questions. As I mentioned, we do record the webinars, including the sound and the slides, and we'll put a link on our website in the next few days, and I also will email all of you who have registered with a link once it's live too, so you can have that and share it with anyone else. As I said, as we're going, we try to do all the questions at the end during the Q&A once we've heard from all the speakers. But if you come up with a question as we're going through, please do feel free to put it in the chat, and I'll save it for the Q&A. Or if it's just something like, oh, can you share that web link? We'll just try to answer it then and there. Okay, that is a bit of my housekeeping. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Sustain, we're a charity in the UK who works on food and farming issues. In very broad terms, this includes advocating food and agricultural policies and practices that enhance the health and welfare of people and animals, that improve the working and living environment, enrich society and culture, and promote equity. So we're an alliance. We represent about 100 national public interest organizations working at international, national, regional, and local levels. We're relatively small with around 25 staff, but our work covers a really wide remit. So we have the Real Bread campaign. We work on Food Power's National Food Poverty Program, Capital Growth's Urban Agriculture Network in London, or Sustainable Fish Cities, which you'll hear about in a few minutes. One of the things we've recently started convening is workshops for a small group of people from programs who are funded by the National Lottery Community Fund in the UK, who work on food. This is called the Food Learning Forum. And the aim of this is really about improving connections and strengthening the sector, and partly is through these workshops that we're holding a few times each year. But what we wanted to do is make sure that any of the learning from the forum in those workshops is shared much more widely with the Sustain Alliance and others working in this area. And so following each of the workshops, we're going to be hosting a webinar on the same topic that's available for everyone to join like this, and that will also live on our website for anyone to listen to at any time. So our first forum workshop was just last week, and we had a focus on behavioral insights and how it relates to food and the food movement. So today we're going to start off by hearing from Jessie Barker from the Behavioural Insights Team to introduce the concept and some of the applications in food. Then that will be followed by 2 case studies of this in action, very different ones with different perspectives. We'll have Amber Wheeler from the Food Foundation sharing about their work on increasing vegetable consumption through Peas Please. And then Ruth Westcott, one of my colleagues at Sustain, will be talking about the Sustainable Fish Cities campaign. And then we'll open it up for questions during, hopefully for about the last 15 minutes or so. So that is it from me. I'm now going to pass over to Jessie.
Great, thanks a lot, Maddie, and thanks everyone for joining. So I'd like to tell you a bit about what behavioural insights are. Maybe you've heard the term, you're not sure what it means, and how it can be applied to food. But let's start out. It's after lunch, you may be feeling a little sleepy. I'm going to offer you a coffee. Which one would you like? So if you're like most people, you'd probably choose the one in the middle. And what if I offered you another day this choice here? Again, if you're like most people, you'd probably choose the one in the middle. But you'll notice that the middle-sized coffee is different on each slide. And yet, consistently, people will choose the middle as kind of the safe option. And so what does this show us? This shows us that what our preferences are, things that we think are relatively fixed, something kind of quite intrinsic to ourselves that we want, is actually very heavily influenced by the context in which we're making the decisions. In this case, what else is available on offer. So let's look at another example. Some of you may have seen this before. Which of these 2 squares is darker, the one in the upper left or the one in the bottom right? Let's have another look. If we connect this joining grey bar, you'll see that these 2 squares are actually exactly the same color. This is an optical illusion. You've probably seen something similar, if not this one. And what this one shows is that our judgment can also be influenced by context. So our judgment of color in this case is influenced by what is the background to those squares that you're seeing. And this may seem like a silly example, but actually the influence of context on our preferences and on our judgment can have very real consequences. So to give you an example of each of those. When patients in hospices, in kind of end-of-life care homes, were given options about what kind of care they could choose, the way that those options are presented to them really affected what they chose, which had direct influences on their own lives. So whether they chose to extend their lives through care or not depends on what the default option presented to them was. So their preferences were influenced just as something as small. Hello, can you hear me yet? Okay, I am back, and I skipped ahead while I was trying to click the slides, which I currently lost. Okay, great, we're back. So our judgment can also be influenced by context. So painting these yellow lines on the train tracks here by kind of giving us a different comparison point for our visual judgment can actually reduce the number of accidents because it helps the drivers reduce their speed. So this is exactly the same principle as an optical illusion. It's just helping us to judge distances better by giving us some kind of visual context. So why are our brains so influenced by context? Well, our brains use shortcuts, heuristics, and biases to make sense of information. We're faced with an overwhelming amount of information in the world. Our brains are trying to sort between what's relevant and what's not, and how to make sense of it. This idea was popularized by Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman several years ago in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. If any of you are interested in this topic and haven't read it, I really recommend it. It's a great read. And he characterize this as two parallel systems for how our brains are processing information. We have what he calls the fast system, system one, and this is kind of automatic, it's unconscious, it's what you were using when you were looking at that optical illusion and thinking that those two colors were different. In parallel, we also have system two, and this is our slower, more conscious and reflective system. And generally, we often think we're relying only on system two, when in fact, the influence of this fast automatic system one comes into play into our decisions a lot more than we realize. So these biases, these shortcuts that our brains use when we're making sense of information that have evolved, have come to be for a good reason because it's helpful to us overall, can actually lead us to make mistakes sometimes when we don't even realize that's going on because it's unconscious. So we know from quite a large amount of academic research that this is going on, that our brains are using these shortcuts. And we also know from the examples that I showed you earlier that this can actually really matter in kind of our day-to-day lives. So the logical conclusion from this is that we should take into account these heuristics and biases that our brains are using when we're making policy. And this was the conclusion put forward by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein in their book Nudge around 10 or so years ago, which was really bringing this research on the way our brains make decisions to the attention of policymakers and saying, hey, policies are often designed in a kind of idealistic way, thinking that people make decisions as rational kind of economic agents weighing up costs and benefits. But we know from kind of more recent studies of social psychology and behavioral economics that isn't how our brains work. So to make policies reflect the way people actually behave rather than the way we idealistically expect them to behave, we need to approach policymaking in a different way. And I think there are a few examples of policies or services being designed really nicely to take into account the way our brains take shortcuts. If you have a look at the picture I've got up here, you can see a cyclist who's just gone over a speed bump, which is actually, if you look a little bit more closely, this is just painted flat on the road, and this gets me every time there's one of these close to where I live, and I still find myself slowing down even though I've been down this road, tens and hundreds of times. So this is an example of an intervention. So it's trying to change people's behavior, it's trying to get drivers to slow down, and it's taking advantage of this kind of context dependence, these heuristics and biases, these shortcuts that our brains use. So I think this is a really nice example of how we can work with the way our brains work in practice rather than against it. But unfortunately, most services, most policies, most programs aren't like this, and they look a little bit more like this. There's a way that a service or a policy is designed for how we expect people to behave in theory, and then there's how it's used in practice, and the user may have quite a different experience. So our goal with behavioral insights is really to bridge this gap and make the design of policies and services reflect how we make decisions, how we really make decisions, and just make them a little bit more human. So who are the Behavioural Insights Team? So we were the world's first government institution that was kind of using behavioural science, and we spun out, so we started in the UK government in 2010. We are now a kind of independent research consultancy for social impact. So we still do a fair amount of work with the UK government, but with many other partners as well. And we really have kind of two broad goals. The first one is bridging the research on decision making, some of the concepts that I've showed you, and kind of putting that into practice to improve policy and services. And the second one, which I won't speak so much about today, is evaluating the impact of doing that, and in general promoting evidence-based policy and practice. So we may have a concept from behavioral science that we think will work really well to change behavior, but we don't know that for sure until we do a rigorous evaluation, until we test it. So that forms a large amount of our work as well. So what are behavioral insights? I've been talking about this a lot, and behavioral insights really comprise three things. So the first one, evidence about behavior. So this is, as I said, using the research on decision making from psychology and behavioral economics. And then the second thing is the practical application of that research. So it's really focused on how is that useful in the real world? How can we change people's behavior in ways that will make their own lives better and make things better for society and the environment? And then the third pillar of behavioral insights is this element of rigorous and robust evaluation, testing, and trialing what actually works. So in terms of using the evidence about behavior, I think there are three really key principles to remember. And the first one is that in general, we overlook the unconscious decision-making processes in favor of thinking that all of our decision-making is kind of reflective, as this slow system, and that we're kind of aware of what we're doing. Whereas in actual fact, a large proportion or quite a large influence on our decisions come from this fast or unconscious processes. And related to this, given that we do rely so much on these unconscious fast processes, we need to focus more on the context in which we're making decisions. I think this is obviously very relevant to food. I showed you that first example of choosing the size of your coffee, and that can have a very real impact on our food and drink consumption patterns. And then thirdly, this sounds kind of obvious to say, but it's actually quite a subtle point. We need to focus on behavior itself rather than on changing people's attitudes, changing people's awareness, or changing people's intentions. I'm sure most of you have an experience from your own lives of when you intended to do something, you genuinely wanted to do something, you told yourself you were going to do it, and you never actually got around to it, even though you really wanted to, even though you were super motivated. It happens to me all the time. And for that reason, if we want to change behavior in the real world, focusing on behavior is really the best way to do that, rather than indirectly through awareness raising or changing people's values or opinions. So behavioral insights in the last several years has become fairly well established in a short space of time as a kind of policy tool, and typically it's tended to emphasize individual decision making. So can we make small tweaks to the context in which people are making decisions to change their behavior? For example, the way options are presented on a menu. And this has been undoubtedly a core part of the behavioral insights approach, and this is the part that is kind of typically referred to as nudging, so making these kind of small, fairly light touch changes to encourage consumers' behavioral change. But this isn't the only way in which we can use behavioral insights. And I think it's often helpful to think about behavioral insights as more of an approach, a perspective, rather than a specific technique that relies on small tweaks to the context. And a really nice example of this, I think, is the sugar tax in the UK that came into force in the last few years. And so this was initially met with some concern before it was implemented that the burden of the tax would fall on customers who were less able to pay. But actually, by setting the thresholds for the tax in an informed way, by doing some modeling beforehand of how companies were likely to respond, we could actually nudge the companies, so encourage the companies to change their behavior to reduce the sugar content to avoid the tax. So they were motivated to do so by the threat of consumers failing to purchase their drinks because they became too expensive. And so by introducing what initially seemed like a consumer-facing tax, it actually ended up being that consumers are still paying the same amount for their drinks, but those drinks now have a reduced sugar content because the companies reformulated their products. And so I think this is a nice example of behavioral insights kind of as a general approach rather than something that is just focused on nudging individual consumers' behavior. And so we can think about this as kind of several different levels at which we can apply behavioral insights. The scale of the intervention on the y-axis on the left-hand side, we can think about kind of small opportunistic delivery of behavioral insights. This is the kind of typical, what we think of as the nudge approach with, through changing communications, we can reduce the small hassles, the friction costs of somebody taking up a service or buying a certain product. But then we can also think about higher level policy changes like the sugary drinks tax that I just mentioned. Those were both examples of interventions using incentives, but we can also think about interventions using providing information to people. Again, we can think about kind of smaller scale, these typical nudges of changing the language in text messages, for example. But then we can also think about it, how can we apply information provision intelligently at a higher level? For example, the level of kind of a whole market shifts to encourage people to switch to a more sustainable or a better energy tariff, which is some work we've done previously. And again, we can think about these two levels, the higher policy level and the kind of smaller scale individual delivery level in terms of legislation and regulation as well. So I give you this just to show you some of the range of behavioral insights approaches. And for the last few minutes of my presentation, I want to focus specifically on the food movement. So how can we apply behavioral insights to encourage people to eat sustainable and healthy food? So I'm going to be thinking mostly about sustainability because that's what my own work is on. Most of the, if not all of the principles that I'm going to talk about can be applied equally to encouraging healthy food consumption. So the key message, the one line, if you want to take something away from this, is that our behavior is highly context dependent and does not necessarily reflect our attitudes. So what does that look like in food? So if you're at a buffet, people are more likely to eat, for example, or choose whatever is presented first. The choices, as we've seen, depend on what the other options are that are available, even if they came to the buffet with an intention to do one thing or awareness of what is most healthy and what is most sustainable. And we're highly susceptible to social influences as well. So this is a street with several, I would say, fairly equivalent falafel restaurants, and yet people are more likely to go to the one where they have to stand even longer waiting in line because other people are already doing so. We like to follow the herd and take cues from other people. So this is the kind of situation that we're working with. How do we then apply it in practice? So there are three key lessons. So to encourage sustainable and healthy food, we want to make it easy for people to access that food. We want to make it appealing for them to do so. And we want to make it normal. So I'm going to give you a few examples from the Behavioural Insights team's work using each of these principles and suggest how it might be applied to the food movement. I should add that we've just published a big report on sustainable diets, how to use behavioral insights to encourage sustainable consumption, and also some tips for policymakers on how to use behavioral insights to encourage public support for policy. So please go ahead and look out for that on our website if you're interested. Let's start with easy. So to make it easy for people to do something, you can make that thing be the default option. So in one project we did with an employer wanting to encourage its employees to donate to charity, if that was included as the default option on people's payroll, then almost half the people chose to remain in that option to donate to charity on their payroll, whereas it was fewer than 10% when they had to actively opt in. And this has obvious implications for sustainable food choices. For example, if people were defaulted into a more sustainable choice, so like a plant-based meal, for example, on a flight, rather than a meat non-vegetarian meal being the default, it's likely that sustainable choices would be much higher. Another way to make things easy for people is to help them make decisions at moments when they are forming new habits. Our food choices are very kind of ingrained and habitual, so we can target people at what we call timely moments. So we did one project encouraging people to sign up to a new bike sharing scheme, and found that by distributing leaflets about this scheme to people who had just moved into an area was around 4 times more effective than giving leaflets about signing up to the scheme to people who were already living there but had a new bike docking station installed in their house. So people, this moment when people are changing their routine, they've just moved into an area, they're doing something new, is much more effective in encouraging them to try something else that's new, to change some other aspect of this routine. And so one promising timely moment for food consumption would be students they're often cooking for themselves for the first time, they've moved away from home, I think it would be a particularly influential time for thinking about sustainable behavior change. And then a final example of easy is in making it helping people substitute a more sustainable option for something they already know. So, for example, by giving people a choice to, instead of having a beef burger, to have a blended beef and mushroom burger. So they're still having a beef burger, it still tastes pretty similar, but the environmental impact of that meal is a lot less. And we actually did a project that was looking at ways to make the blended burger sound more appealing on a menu by changing the name. So just by changing the name on a menu from blended burger to beef and mushroom burger or steakhouse flavor burger, increased the rate at which people chose a blended burger from the menu. And that brings me to the next category, appealing. So this is, how can we make sustainable choices, even if they're exactly the same underlying choice, exactly the same food, sound more appealing or seem more appealing to people? And one way is framing, and that means changing descriptions, changing labels. So the blended burger is one example. Another project we did with the World Resources Institute was looking at multiple different plant-based dishes and what names we could choose to encourage people to choose those options from a menu. And we found that in general, options, language that emphasizes flavor and taste, that makes it sound indulgent, it doesn't make it sound like it's lacking something. Would you like something that's meat-free? It sounds like, well, where's the meat? Instead, field grown was one that worked well. Better sausage and mash, anything that makes it sound appealing. Another way is to use incentives, and this has been a approach that's very heavily used, but we can again think about kind of more creative ways to use incentives. So this example from a survey, encouraging people to respond to a survey, when people are pre-entered into a prize draw rather than being told that they'd be entered after they take the survey, encouraged a higher response rate. And that's one example of kind of a creative use of incentives. So another, for example, if we're thinking about food choices, you could incentivize more sustainable food choices by including only those sustainable options in some kind of meal deal. So incentivize the option that you want people to take. And so our final category, how to make something normal. So we follow social norms a lot. We like to do what other people are doing, what others around us specifically are doing. We like to do what's in the majority. We ran a project looking at how to reduce antibiotic prescription among GPs in the UK, and found that by simply sending a letter that included this line, and this was true, that many other practices, the majority of practices in the area, were prescribing more antibiotics. This encouraged GPs who had been over-prescribing and received this letter to reduce their antibiotics prescription, because they felt like they kind of unconsciously needed to be in line with social norms. So this can be quite a powerful influence on our behavior. And again, this is something that we could apply directly to the food movement. If it's not the case that a behavior is in it's the majority, we can use what's called a dynamic norm. So more and more people, so a growing number of people are adopting this behavior. And so publicizing this can be an effective way to encourage people to change their behavior. And finally, another way to make sustainable options more normal is to integrate them into a menu rather than separating them into a separate box. And we tested this with two different menu versions. The one on the left has the meat and fish options and the vegetarian options in separate boxes. One on the right is integrated. And we found that with that integrated menu, the treatment menu, people were more likely to choose vegetarian dishes when they were separated off into the side and pitched as something other, something weird. Okay, so we've talked about making things easy, appealing, and normal. I'd just like to finish up by mentioning again this idea of double nudges, that nudges don't have to just be individual behavior. We can kind of use the potential for kind of consumer choice, so individual consumers, to influence behavior at a higher level. So instead of thinking about, can we label individual food items so that consumers themselves can choose between more sustainable options, would it be more effective to rate entire supermarkets, retailers, on how sustainable they are. So this is a similar idea to a food hygiene rating in the UK. And that way, that would leverage competition between retailers for customers, to encourage retailers, supermarkets, to make their own practices more sustainable, rather than placing the burden on the consumer to make sense of what's already quite a large number of different labels for food. So I'd like to leave you with that as, well, food for thought, I guess, as it were, and highlight again that for more information, please go and check out this report on its website, and we'll give you some more ideas for making it easy, appealing, and normal to choose sustainable food. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Jessie. We're now going to pass over to Amber from the Food Foundation to tell us about Peace Please.
Hi. So I'm going to talk about Peace Please, which is an initiative in the UK to drive up vegetable consumption. It was started around 2016 and really got going in 2017. It's run as a collaboration between the Food Foundation, which works on food system change for health for all and sustainable food for all, along with Nourish Scotland, Belfast Food Network, Great Taste Northern Ireland, and Food Sense Wales. We've recently got some funding from the Community Fund, which has greatly helped our ability to do this work. So I just wanted to talk briefly about the old approach to increasing fruit and vegetable consumption, and it goes along with what Jessie was talking about in terms of telling people doesn't necessarily work. So the old approach to increasing fruit and veg consumption was the 5 a day campaign, which I'm sure most of you know about, and that was very much, as this diagram shows, aimed at trying to change the whole of the food system by just telling the consumer to eat more. And we would argue that this was highly ineffective. I often use the example of Wales. When the 5 a day campaign began in 2003, 39% of people claimed to be eating 5 a day. In 2017, this had gone down to 24%. So this sort of highly known of campaign initiative, and yet it hasn't translated into changes in behaviour. So what our approach in Peace Please is a bit like this. It's that we work with the whole of the food system to try and increase vegetable consumption. So we're trying to change the system to make it easier for people to eat veg, at the same time as working with consumers or citizens, however you like to term them. It's very much based on the idea that we're all in this together. It's not just about those consumers who don't eat their vegetables. It's about all of us playing our part to drive up vegetable consumption in our own sectors. And we all have a part to play. And this is very much behind the success, I think, of the project in terms of the number of people who we've got involved. So to date, last year we had this slide shows that we have 85 pledges, but that's gone up to nearly 100 now. So the pledges are people who've said that they're going to increase the amount of veg that they have on offer, or make it more available, or produce more. So we have 80% of the supermarkets represented in our pledges. We have 65 to 75 contract caterers, and we have, it says 22 veg cities, but I know that we're now up to 25 veg cities who are all working to increase the amount of veg on offer. The examples of some of the activities of the pledges are caterers are putting 2 portions of veg into every kid's meal. People like Wetherspoons have now committed to that. So it's that default, it's like changing it from a 1 as standard to every child's menu will now have 2 from going forward. We also work with food on the go type restaurants. Greg's is an example of what they've done is to increase the amount of veg in their sandwiches. and in their soups. Retailers have committed to better signposting for veg in higher footfall areas, and then changing the branding on veg. For instance, Lidl's done a lot of work on targeting vegetables at children. In terms of retailers, Tesco's has also done some work on increasing the amount of veg in ready meals. So for people who don't automatically go for veg as a separate item, they will get more veg through their ready meals. Contract caterers, producers and broadcasters have all different types of pledges we've been involved with. So ways of encouraging the pledges so far, we've co-produced the initial pledge, so it's very much working with people to see what they can do in their setting. And we've fostered sort of a healthy competition between pledges, so saying that this pledge is doing this, what can you do? So trying to work with the sector to see with the businesses to see what they can do. Very much this simultaneous engagement idea that we're all doing this at the same time. There's no excuse. You can't blame it on somebody else for not producing more, or somebody else for not consuming more, or somebody else for not making it more available. We found that social events for networking have been very important, and as time goes on, we are using more stick than carrot in terms of trying to incentivize change. So very much we've got a very strong monitoring process where every year the businesses and pledgers have to report on a sort of traffic light system, what they've done, and they'll be get their results in a traffic light. So in terms of impact, so far, and this is over the last 2 years, we've led to there's 89.9 million more veg portions being bought in from our pledges. So it sounds pretty impressive, but we know that to reach the now 7 a day target of government in terms of fruit and vegetables combined, we need 75 billion more portions. So we are quite a long way off achieving that, but it is a start. Another tactic we've employed is recognizing that in the past there hasn't been much advertising of fruit and veg. Only 1.2% of advertising spend was on fruit and vegetables, compared to about 70% for confectionery. So last year we launched a sister campaign called Veg Power, and there were adverts which you may have seen called Eat Them to Defeat Them that went out on ITV, and this was very much to make it fun and exciting and change the narrative from a sort of boring "you must eat your veg because it's healthy" to something quite interesting. So this year it's going to be going out actually on the 24th of February it starts again, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. So in terms of impact of that Veg Power advertising campaign, 38.2 million people saw that ad, 48% of households with children. So it really did get out there. But as Jessie said, did it change any behaviour? This is attitudes and claim behavior. So people who saw the advert were more likely to say positive things about vegetables, like, "I think eating vegetables can be fun. I like vegetables. I asked to try a new vegetable recently," etc., etc. But did that translate into more vegetables being purchased? The data that we have from Kantar World Panel is that there was an uplift in consumption of 1.7% for under 16. So a small amount, but a significant amount given the challenge. Overall, 2.3%, there was an increase on vegetable sales during that very small time. So the Veg Power campaign last year was only for 6 weeks, and it'll be going again. this year to try and continue to drive up those sales of fruit and veg. So these are the weeks that it's going, the different vegetables of the weeks, and the adverts are slightly adapted from last year, but it will be going out on ITV, Sky and Channel 4. So this is, there's just 2 more slides now. One is about our new Veg Advocates program, which is about, we're recruiting 100 new veg advocates from across the communities across the UK to try and link people into Peas Please and as agents of change to try and push our businesses to do better and policymakers to do better. And the final slide is about reflecting on our own behaviour and what makes what we do work. And this is, I suggest it's a sort of food diplomacy that's going on, and these are all the different aspects. If I've got time, I will just quickly go through them. One is a clear focus on vision, but a flexibility on how to get there. Empathy and inclusivity, navigating power dynamics, humility, very important, persistence and the ability to adapt and change. All of these different aspects on this slide have really helped us in Peas Please to deliver what we're delivering. So this slide shows a bit more about information that's available, and there'll be questions at the end. Thank you, Maddie.
Thanks, Amber. And now we've got a few questions coming in for Amber, which I'll ask her to address during the Q&A. I'm just making a note of those to save for that time. And so now we're going to head over to Ruth.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me onto this webinar. I'll assume that you can hear me okay. If you can't, give me a thumbs down, and then I will make sure that my audio is better. Right, so I'm going to crack on as we're a bit short of time. So I'll rush through a little bit. If there's any burning questions as we go through, just stick them down on that chat, and then we can come to them again at the questions section. So as a really quick overview, Sustainable Fish City is a good example of nudge theory, I think, where we're trying to influence the behaviour of businesses, not of individuals. So we're trying to look a bit further up the supply chain and not necessarily suggest that the problems in our seafood consumption are a result of individual choices, but the choices of businesses in putting in what fish ends up on our plates. So the campaign is all about aiming to get rid of unsustainable fish off menus in the UK, and it began just in the run-up to the 2012 Olympics when we got sustainable fish on those menus. We're just aiming to get businesses to sign a pledge, and therefore I think that the barriers to entry are very low. The pledge is the same for every business, and all it asks to sign up is one significant action, but it commits you to a range of actions that are more difficult, that take a little bit longer. So it's easy to get on board, but you're committing to things that are more significant over the longer term. Now, as you can see, the model of the Sustainable Fish City campaign is about driving large-scale change and aiming to achieve a target number of these sustainable fish pledges across a town or city. And so we've broken down a city into these different sectors. And each city, to become a sustainable fish city, is aiming to get a target number of pledges in each of these different sectors. Now, by doing that, not only are you setting up competition, a sort of friendly level of competition between different cities, and one city thinks, oh, well, my neighbour is doing that, we want to get involved, but also you're setting up competition between different businesses within a city. So you can contact a hospital and say, we're really pleased to announce that the university has come on board, and now we need you to sign up to allow us to become a sustainable fish city and get on the next rung of the ladder. As you can see, there are those 5 stars, and the campaign has that 5-star approach, which means that you gather stars according to how many pledges you've got. And same way, there's a low barrier to entry. Some cities are on a 1-star, and then over time they'll gradually increase, so you can celebrate progress along the way. Here are some of the businesses that we've got on board so far. So as you can see, we've got a spread across the public sector and the private sector, from very large businesses to smaller businesses. And yeah, so as you can see, this is the map here of the towns and cities that are working towards becoming a sustainable fish city. And you can see that is taken from the homepage of the Sustainable Fish Cities website. So you can see we really clearly map the progress across the country and try to capitalise on that pride in people's local area and natural competition between places. And as you can see, we also mark how well each city is progressing along that 5-star criteria. So yeah, just a couple of bullet points about why I think, you know, this taps into behavioural insights. So a business serving sustainable fish is actually logically not really a priority. It isn't necessarily, you know, it's often a bit more expensive, and customers aren't necessarily choosing it. You know, they're just not making a big fuss about fish really in the UK. It's a nice to have rather than something that would change people's behaviour or their choice of where they would eat out. So we've tapped into that sense of local pride and competition. We use that help your city become the next sustainable fish city a lot. We tap into that pride. We also, you know, by making the pledge low entry, you know, low barrier to entry, people can get involved by taking a few simple steps, and then it commits them to more action over the longer term. And we also asked inspirational people to pledge first. So there's Raymond Blanc with a big old cutout fish, and he is a fairly big time celebrity chef. He's actually French in the UK. He's quite a big chef. And so his support for the campaign really showed that there's that influencers are really behind the project. Now, this slide is just a bit interesting because it shows we asked very large contract caterers what their motivations were for switching to verifiably sustainable fish. And it's interesting that that pressure from NGOs they self-declared was the lowest, which I don't think is surprising because they wouldn't want to admit that our action was having an impact. But you'll see that the second to top, which I've circled in orange, says they think it's important for their overall reputation as a company, but that comes much higher than they think there's concern amongst the public. So actually, they don't think their customers are that bothered, but they are bothered for almost their own ego and their own reputation. So that has actually made us think maybe it's more about giving them a nice press release and a nice certificate and a nice like pat on the back. And that for them is more important necessarily than for engaging with their customers. So that's just kind of an interesting insight. And then finally, the most important reason was just that the availability of sustainable fish. So yeah, they will just path of least resistance stuff, that isn't it? If the sustainable fish is there, then they will put it on the menu. And so actually following that, we've done quite a lot of work with businesses up the supply chain, their suppliers, to make it clear and obvious which fish is sustainable, because that will help break down those barriers. This, and again, tapping into companies' reputation, we've also done some league tables. This is one of very large contract caterers. And this has worked especially well because these are all direct competitors and we were able to rank them against each other. And they will all be vying for the same fish buying contracts. So we knew that ranking them against each other would be quite successful. And we found actually that having something visible like that, which really showed the difference in their policies, was very helpful for people, not just for us to show the difference, but for individuals within those companies to make the case for doing better internally with the higher echelons and the board. We also tried affecting their reputation. So we did some Point the Fish Finger campaign where we asked individuals to write, to do an online e-action to write to the CEOs of companies. And that was fairly successful. Again, it was targeting the reputation of CEOs. And we did some really nice press when they agreed to our requests to improve their sustainable fish buying policy. But there's also a really good example of where actually behavioural insights I don't think work all the time because we've just managed to get all the businesses that operate within the terminals at Heathrow Airport to sign up to a sustainable fish buying policy, and that had absolutely nothing to do with behavioural insight. There was just an individual who has control over what is sold inside the airport. and they said they wanted all the businesses to sell sustainable fish, so we worked with them to make that happen. So yeah, I think one thing to take away from this is that the person who needs to make the change needs to want that, or no amount of behavioural insight is going to help to make that campaign successful. So there you go, that's my details if anybody's interested. I'm also at Fish Cities on Twitter as a bit of a shameless plug there. But otherwise, thank you. And we'll go back to Maddie now and take questions, I think. Thank you. It's mute, sorry.
Thank you very much, Ruth, and to Amber and Jessie. We've got a few questions that have come in already, so I'm going to start there. The first few were for Amber about Peas Please. So Amber, there's 3 for you, so I'll say them all, and then if you want to address them as you want. Vera was wondering if there's any plans to bring Eat Them to Defeat Them campaign onto TfL, which is Transport for London's network. Tim was wondering if there's any social media content to support the Veg Power campaign as well as the TV ad. So those 2 are just about what's coming out soon. And Lisa was wondering how exactly the impact of the Eat Them to Defeat Them campaign has been measured in terms of dietary change. The slide mentioned the Kantar data. What is this? If you could explain it a bit more. So do you want to start with those, Amber?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of Eat Them to Defeat Them onto Transport for London, I'm not sure. I can pass that on to the team. They're mainly concentrating on schools. So we have 1,400 schools who will be receiving packs with posters which back and all sorts of information that back up the Veg Power, the Eat Them to Defeat Them ad. So yeah, I'll pass on about the Transport for London as an idea. I'm sure they've already thought of it, but yes, thank you for that as a tip. In terms of social media, please go to the Veg Power website. There's a whole range of different resources there that could be used in terms of social media. In terms of impact and Kantar, so how they measured that was Kantar collect statistics on sales of food from supermarkets and from till. They get a sample of people to do till receipts, so their data is quite robust. And what they did was monitor the sales during the Eat Them to Defeat Them campaign compared to last year and the year before and the year before, to see whether the sales could be shown to show an uplift compared to the past, the sort of comparable time in the past. And that was externally evaluated also by Cambridge University. So if you go to the Veg Power website, there's an evaluation report available, and it goes into the details of how that statistic was, how they came up with that statistic. That's the answers. That's my answers.
Yeah, thank you, Amber. I've then got one from Alicia, who was asking Ruth. She said that she was surprised that shareholders and investors and CSR policy was so high on the list. Wanted to know if this also surprised you, Ruth.
Yeah, a little bit. I don't. This was self-reported by the caterers, so it might just have been that they wanted to show that was more important than NGO action. It might just have been that they wanted to make NGO the lowest preference. Yeah, I was a bit surprised. I don't really know much about shareholder. My knowledge about all that shareholder interaction and investment stuff is minimal, really. Oh, maybe Alicia can. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer actually.
That's a good fair response from Ruth on that one. We then had a question from Tabitha had a question for Jessie. She said, "What do you think about the ethics of nudging, and how do you handle criticism that it is not ethical?"
Yeah, I think that's something that comes up a lot, and I think the first key thing to remember is that everybody is being influenced all the time. So one of the criticisms is, nudging is manipulation, but is it any different to walking into a grocery store any day? The products have been laid out in a deliberate way to presumably provide maximum profit for the grocery store, which is generally not in line with our own health and sustainability interests. So I think once you realize that there are such big contextual influences on our behavior, there's essentially no neutral choice. I mean, you could lay stuff out totally randomly, but then if you do know that some ways would encourage more healthy and sustainable consumption than others, then why would you choose to not do that? And I think that's kind of my second big point, which is we are influencing people's behavior in a way that is better for them and generally in line with what they would want from their own behavior. But because they mentioned at the beginning, people's behavior often doesn't match up with their intentions, they don't actually do that behavior in practice. So if someone said to me that I'm going to arrange the contents of this shop so that it makes it easier for you to choose things that are more healthy, I would be happy for them to do that, because that's kind of something that I want anyway, and but isn't necessarily the thing I think about every time I'm in the supermarket. So I think there is some element of we're not kind of nudging against people's best interest, or at least people who are nudging responsibly or not. There's actually a term called sludge, which is kind of dark side of nudging, if you like. So this is when you get you're on a free trial and the link to click on to cancel your subscription is buried somewhere right at the bottom. It's making it as difficult as possible for you to do something. So there are definitely people, organizations kind of using nudging against people's best interest, but anybody who's doing it responsibly will make sure through kind of engaging with stakeholders, kind of co-creating interventions, that it is not kind of something that people would be unhappy with if they were unaware it was going on.
Yeah, thanks, Jessie. I also remember from having read that book, Nudge, that they talked a lot about defaults and how what is set what is set as a default can make a really big difference. For example, if a company chooses, like when you're choosing your pension scheme or something like that, if the default is one option out of 3 options, that is a nudge, versus if they don't even give you a default. So it was kind of, it's like, I think it's a good question about sort of the ethics around it, but also thinking like we're not making decisions in a vacuum to begin with. Like when you walk into a supermarket, they're designed in a way to maximize profits, for example, and things like vegetables are probably less profit making. So it's an interesting one, but I do think the book, if anyone's interested in it more, that book is really it picks that apart quite a bit and says, kind of this book might not be for you if you disagree with some of these core tenets, but it's a really interesting one to unpack a bit. We've got 2 more questions that have come in. One, and anyone could jump on this, Ruth, Amber, or Jessie. Rebecca asked, can you say how any of these policies address dietary inequalities or social determinants of health? Does anyone want to?
Well, in terms of what we're doing at Peas Please, we're really trying to make sure that what we're doing is reaching as many people as possible, and that's why we work with the supermarkets and not just sort of alternative food system, I guess, and to make it as affordable as possible at the same time as supporting producers, sort of thing. We also trying to work on the expanding the Healthy Start scheme so that people who do need a bit of help affording fruit and veg might be able to get it through that, but there's a long way to go on that, and Maddie knows knows a lot about that too. So we do try and work to increase, to help people at all income levels.
Yeah. I'll go to our last question just because it's 3:30, so people have to run. So this will be the last one for Jessie, and then we'll wrap it up there. It's a question from Gustavo, who's asked, what can be an effective behavioral insights approach to engage citizens to participate in innovation-driven food systems workshops?
So from understanding, I'm not totally sure what angle you're getting at with the question, but I'll address the kind of engagement angle rather than the innovation-driven specific angle. So yeah, the variety of behavioral insights approaches we can use to increase engagement, kind of using the same principles really that I talked about, the easy, appealing, and normal. You can make it easy for people to take up opportunities, which, you know, sometimes, again, it's a question of like, maybe you intend to do something, maybe you intend to volunteer for something, but you just don't get around to it. So we can think about how to remove the small, what we call friction costs, the kind of little hassles that get in the way. Social influences, again, are a big one. So it could be, you know, who the message comes from. Is it somebody who you see as being like you, who's kind of already running this or kind of pitching it as something that you might like to do? Is it kind of a something that you see as a social norm? Could it be a kind of group activity? You get several of your friends and go to workshops together, giving people a sense of kind of control. This is your chance to have an influence. And then other ways to make it more appealing as well. So I mentioned different types of incentives for participation. You can, you know, kind of combine that with the making it normal, with refer a friend type incentives. So yeah, I'd say those three general principles that I mentioned for sustainable consumption can also be applied to other kind of other policy areas as well.
Great, thank you. Vera's put in a really good question, but Vera, I think because of time, I'm gonna have to not address it, but I'll just say it for everyone to think about as our closing food for thought. She wrote, interesting to reflect that the original nudge target for the sugar levy was not the resultant outcome. I'm thinking about this in the context of reducing meat consumption. The two options right now are more pulses veg or meat substitutes that aren't nutritionally as good as the former. Any thoughts on this? But I think maybe we'll leave that one for us all to percolate on as we go through. So thank you everyone for joining the webinar today. And as I said, we will email everyone a link to it once the recording is online, so you can share that. And you can stay tuned for future webinars we'll be doing again soon. So thank you again to Jessie, Amber, and Ruth for joining us today. And thanks for everyone for listening.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye.